Jack Reacher had no particular destination in mind. That was the point. He owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a foldable toothbrush. He carried no phone, no ties, and no plans. He went where the road took him, and today, the road had deposited him in Redemption, Arizona. The name was ironic, plastered on a faded sign that creaked in the hot, dry wind. The town looked less like a place of salvation and more like a place forgotten by time itself. He stepped off the Greyhound bus, the only passenger to disembark. The bus hissed and pulled away, leaving him alone in a cloud of dust and diesel fumes. Main Street was a single strip of asphalt flanked by two-story buildings with weathered wooden facades. A general store, a diner with a buzzing neon sign that read "Eat," a sheriff's office, and a bar. That was about it. It was quiet. Too quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleepy town, but a heavy, watchful silence. The kind of quiet that means everyone is listening. Reacher stretched, his 6'5" frame drawing an immediate glance from an old man sitting on a bench outside the general store. The man's eyes, watery and pale, flickered over Reacher's size, his plain clothes, and his lack of luggage. Then the man looked away, too quickly, fixing his gaze on the dusty street as if Reacher had never existed. Reacher's internal clock told him it was just past noon. The sun was high and unforgiving. He needed coffee. He headed for the diner, the screen door groaning in protest as he pushed it open. The smell of stale coffee and fried bacon hit him. The place was empty except for a young woman behind the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth. She looked up, and for a split second, Reacher saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Not surprise. Fear. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a practiced, weary smile. "Table or counter?" she asked, her voice low. "Counter is fine," Reacher said, sliding onto a worn vinyl stool. She placed a menu in front of him. It was a single laminated sheet, the corners peeling. "Coffee?" "Please, black." She moved to the coffee pot, her movements efficient but tense. Reacher watched her reflection in the polished chrome of the napkin dispenser. She was young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair tied back in a ponytail. There were faint, dark circles under her eyes. She brought the coffee. It was hot and bitter, just the way he liked it. He took a slow sip, his eyes scanning the street through the diner's large plate glass window. Nothing moved except for a tumbleweed bouncing lazily across the road. "Passing through?" she asked, her back to him as she restocked sugar packets. "Something like that," Reacher said. He didn't offer any more. He didn't need to. His presence was already a question mark in this town, and he preferred it that way. The diner door opened again, this time with a jingle of a small bell. Two men walked in. They were big, not as tall as Reacher, but wide and thick with muscle that came from labor, not a gym. They wore dusty jeans, work boots, and plaid shirts with the sleeves rolled up to reveal sun-darkened forearms. They moved with an easy arrogance, as if they owned the place. Maybe they did. They ignored Reacher and took a booth by the window. The waitress, whose name tag read Sarah, went over to them immediately. Her smile was gone. Her shoulders were hunched. "The usual Jeb?" she asked one of them. The one named Jeb, a man with a thick neck and a mean-looking scar across his cheek, didn't look at her. He was looking at Reacher. "Who's the tourist?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Just a customer," Sarah said quietly. "Doesn't look like a customer," the other man chimed in. He had a weaselly face and small, close-set eyes. "Looks like trouble." Reacher kept drinking his coffee, his gaze fixed on the street outside. He heard them, of course. He heard everything. He was trained to. He knew they were talking for his benefit. It was a test, a warning. "We don't get a lot of strangers here," Jeb said, his voice louder now, making sure Reacher heard. "We like it that way." Reacher finished his coffee and placed the mug down on the counter with a soft click. He stood up, pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket and leaving them by the mug. He turned to leave, his path taking him past their booth. "Hey," Jeb called out, "I'm talking to you." Reacher stopped but didn't turn to face him. He could feel their eyes on his back. He could feel Sarah's terrified gaze from behind the counter. The air in the small diner was thick with tension. "You deaf, friend?" the weaselly one asked, a sneer in his voice. Reacher slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting Jeb's. Reacher's face was a mask of calm indifference. "I'm not your friend," he said, his voice flat and even. "And I heard you. I just didn't care." For a moment, nobody moved. Jeb's face darkened with anger. He started to slide out of the booth, his hand balling into a fist. The weaselly one was already on his feet. Sarah let out a small, sharp gasp. Then the diner door opened again. A man in a sheriff's uniform stood there, a hand resting on his hip near his sidearm. He was tall and lean, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a smile that didn't reach his cold blue eyes. "Everything all right in here, boys?" Sheriff Brody asked, his gaze flicking from Jeb and his partner to Reacher. Jeb relaxed back into the booth. "Just welcoming the newcomer, Sheriff." "Well, that's mighty neighborly of you," Brody said, his smile widening. He walked over to Reacher, his boots clicking on the linoleum floor. "Welcome to Redemption. I'm Sheriff Brody. We don't get many visitors." "I can see why," Reacher replied. Brody's smile tightened at the edges. "We're a quiet community. We like to keep things peaceful. I'd appreciate it if you helped us do that." It wasn't a request. It was an order. "I'm a peaceful man," Reacher said, "but I don't like being crowded." "Good," Brody said, "because this town can get real small, real fast for folks who cause problems." He looked Reacher up and down, a flicker of professional assessment in his eyes. "You staying long? Long enough for another coffee?" Reacher said, turning his back on the sheriff and walking back to the counter. He sat down. "Another one," he said to Sarah, who was staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. She nodded, her hand shaking as she picked up the coffee pot. Sheriff Brody stood there for a long moment, the silence stretching out. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. He turned and walked out, letting the screen door slam shut behind him. Jeb and his friend muttered something to each other, then went back to their menu, casting dark looks at Reacher's back. Reacher drank his second coffee slowly, letting the silence settle again. He had planned to be on the next bus out, maybe tomorrow morning. But now, something had changed. He wasn't being welcomed. He was being warned off, and Jack Reacher didn't like being warned off. He had stumbled into something here in Redemption. The town had a secret, and its guardians were nervous. He decided he might just stay a little longer. After leaving the diner, Reacher walked the length of Main Street. It didn't take long. He saw no life, no children playing, no neighbors chatting over fences, just closed doors and drawn curtains. He saw the same watchful eyes peering out from behind them, disappearing the moment he looked their way. The town was a prison, and its inmates were also its guards. He needed a place to sleep. There was no motel, but the sign on the general store advertised rooms for rent upstairs. He went inside. The same old man from the bench was now behind the counter, reading a newspaper. He looked up over his spectacles as Reacher entered, his expression sour. "Looking for something?" the old man grunted. "A room," Reacher said. "All full," the man said, turning a page of his newspaper. Reacher looked around the dusty, empty store. "Doesn't look like you're having a tourist boom." The man lowered his paper. His eyes were hard. "I said we're full. You got a hearing problem?" Reacher just stared at him. A long, silent stare that carried more weight than any threat. The old man's bluster began to crumble. He licked his lips, his gaze darting towards the door. "Look, mister," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You don't want to stay here. The next bus leaves at 6 a.m. You should be on it." "Why?" Reacher asked. "It's just not a good place for strangers, for your own health." "I'll take my chances," Reacher said. "The room." The old man sighed, a sound of profound defeat. He reached under the counter and pulled out a tarnished brass key with a wooden tag that read, 3. $20, in advance, and don't cause no trouble. The Daltons don't like trouble. The Daltons? Reacher asked, taking the key. The old man's face went pale. He snatched the $20 bill from Reacher's hand and shoved it into a cash box. I didn't say nothing. You get room 3. Stairs are in the back. He immediately buried his face back in his newspaper, a clear dismissal. Reacher went up the creaking stairs to a narrow hallway. Room 3 was small and sparse, with a single bed, a rickety nightstand, and a window that overlooked a dusty alley. It was clean enough. He dropped the key on the nightstand and looked out the window. Down below, he saw Jeb and his weaselly friend leaning against a pickup truck, watching the general store, watching him. They weren't even trying to be subtle. He knew he was a problem they had to solve, and they would try to solve it soon, probably after dark. He lay down on the bed, fully clothed, and closed his eyes. He wasn't going to sleep. He was going to wait. Night fell over Redemption like a shroud. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Reacher waited in the darkness of his room, his senses on high alert. He had wedged the flimsy wooden chair under the doorknob. It wouldn't stop a determined entry, but it would make noise. It would give him a second. A second was all he ever needed. Around midnight, he heard it. The soft crunch of gravel in the alley below his window. He moved from the bed, silent as a shadow, and positioned himself against the wall next to the door. He heard the faint creak of the stairs, then the soft tread of footsteps in the hallway. They stopped outside his room. Silence. They were listening, trying to determine if he was asleep. Then a metallic click as a lockpick was inserted into the old, simple lock. Reacher smiled grimly in the dark. Amateurs. The lock turned with a soft thunk. The doorknob began to rotate slowly. The door pushed inward, met the resistance of the chair, and stopped with a sharp crack as the wood splintered. That was the noise he was waiting for. The door flew open with a kick, smashing the broken chair aside. 2 figures, silhouetted by the dim light of the hallway, burst into the room. It was Jeb and his partner. Jeb was holding a baseball bat. The other one had a tire iron. They expected to find him in bed, a sleeping man, easy to subdue. They found an empty bed and a dark, silent room. "Where is he?" the weaselly one whispered, his voice tight with nerves. "Find him," Jeb growled. Reacher didn't give them the chance. He lunged from the shadows. He moved with a speed and precision that was terrifying in a man his size. His first target was the man with the tire iron. Reacher's elbow shot out, a short, sharp jab that connected with the man's temple. There was a sickening crunch. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed like a sack of grain, the tire iron clattering on the wooden floor. Jeb spun around, swinging the baseball bat wildly in the dark. The bat whistled through the air, inches from Reacher's head. Reacher stepped inside the swing, his left hand grabbing the bat, his right hand shooting out in a palm-heel strike to Jeb's nose. Cartilage and bone gave way with a wet, popping sound. Jeb screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, dropping the bat and clutching his face as blood poured through his fingers. Reacher didn't stop. He drove a knee into Jeb's midsection, doubling him over. As Jeb gasped for air, Reacher brought his clasped hands down on the back of the man's thick neck. Jeb grunted and pitched forward onto the floor, unconscious before he landed next to his partner. The entire fight had taken less than 5 seconds. It was over in brutal silence. Reacher stood over the 2 unconscious men, his breathing steady. He hadn't even broken a sweat. He went to the window and looked down into the alley. A third man, the driver, was waiting by the pickup truck. He saw the light from the hallway spill into the room and then heard the sounds of the brief, one-sided fight. He hesitated for a second, then jumped into the truck, started the engine with a roar, and sped away, leaving his companions behind. Reacher knew the message would be delivered. He had failed the test. He had refused the warning. Now they knew he wasn't just some drifter. He was something else entirely. He looked at the 2 men on his floor. He could leave them there for the sheriff to find. But that would involve questions, paperwork, and complications. He preferred a cleaner solution. He grabbed Jeb by the collar and dragged him out of the room and down the stairs. He did the same with the other man. It was hard work, but Reacher was used to it. He hauled them out the back door and dumped them in a large, foul-smelling dumpster in the alley. They would wake up in a few hours with splitting headaches, broken noses, and a newfound respect for strangers. He went back to his room. The door was broken, but it didn't matter. No one would be bothering him again tonight. He lay back down on the bed, this time to actually get some sleep. The game had started. The ball was in their court. He wondered what the Daltons' next move would be. The next morning, Reacher was back in the diner. Sarah was behind the counter, looking even more nervous than the day before. The whole town was buzzing with a low, anxious energy. News traveled fast in a place like Redemption. The story of the two toughs who had been found in a dumpster, beaten and broken, was probably all over town by sunrise. She brought him his coffee without a word. Her hands were trembling. "You should leave," she whispered, not looking at him. "They'll kill you. The Daltons own this town. They own the sheriff, the judge, everything." "Who are the Daltons?" Reacher asked, his voice calm. She flinched, looking around the empty diner as if the walls had ears. "Elias Dalton and his two sons. They run a big ranch outside of town, but that's just a front. They're into other things, nasty things. They took over this town about 5 years ago. Anyone who stands up to them disappears. My father, he was the sheriff before Brody. He asked too many questions. One day he just didn't come home." Her voice broke on the last few words. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her face a mask of grief and fear. "My name is Rosalie," she said, her voice stronger now. "Not Sarah. I use a different name. I try to stay invisible, but I've been watching, waiting. I have things, evidence, shipping manifests, account ledgers. My father kept a secret file. I found it after he was gone. It's not enough to go to the state police. The Daltons have connections everywhere. It would be my word against theirs, and I'd end up like my father." "Where is this file?" Reacher asked. "Hidden. Somewhere safe." She finally looked at him, her eyes pleading. "You're different. You're not afraid of them. I saw what you did to Jeb and his friend. No one has ever stood up to them like that." "I'm not here to be a hero," Reacher said. "I'm just passing through." "Are you?" she asked. "Or did you stop here for a reason? Maybe this is the reason." The diner door opened and Sheriff Brody walked in. He saw Reacher and his face hardened. He ignored Rosalie and walked straight to Reacher's stool. "You and I need to have a talk," Brody said, his voice low and menacing. "We're talking," Reacher said. "Outside." Reacher took another sip of his coffee, then slowly stood up, towering over the sheriff. He followed Brody out into the bright morning sun. 2 deputy cars were parked outside, engines running. 4 deputies stood by the cars, their hands on their holstered weapons. It was an ambush. "You've caused a lot of trouble, mister," Brody said, his hand resting on his gun. "Assault? Disturbing the peace? I could lock you up for a long time." "They came into my room with a baseball bat and a tire iron," Reacher said flatly. "That's breaking and entering and attempted assault with a deadly weapon. You should be arresting them." "Their word against yours," Brody sneered. "And in my town, my friend's word is law. So here's the deal. You're going to get in your car and drive away. You're not going to look back. You're going to forget you ever saw the town of Redemption. If you do, you get to live." "I don't have a car," Reacher said. Brody's eye twitched. "Then you'll walk." "I don't care. Just disappear. This is your only warning." Reacher looked past Brody at the 4 deputies. They were nervous, but they were ready. He looked back at Brody. "No," Reacher said. Brody's face contorted in a mask of fury. "Wrong answer. Boys, arrest him." The deputies moved in. Reacher didn't wait for them to surround him. He exploded into motion. He took 2 long strides and slammed his shoulder into Brody, sending the sheriff staggering back into one of his deputies. Reacher's hand shot out and snatched the pistol from Brody's holster before the sheriff even knew what was happening. He spun, using Brody as a shield. The other 3 deputies froze, their hands hovering over their guns. "Nobody move!" Reacher's voice was a whip crack, a command honed by years in the military police. It was a voice that expected to be obeyed. "Shoot him!" Brody choked out, struggling in Reacher's grasp. The deputies hesitated. They were local cops, not trained soldiers. They were faced with a man who had disarmed their boss in 2 seconds and was now holding him hostage with his own gun. "Think about it," Reacher said, his voice calm and lethal. "Is working for the Daltons worth dying for? Because if one of you draws, your sheriff is the first to go. Then I'll deal with you. How fast do you think you are? Faster than a bullet?" The deputies looked at each other, their resolve crumbling. They were bullies and thugs in uniform, not heroes. "Drop your weapons," Reacher commanded. "Now!" One by one, they slowly unbuckled their gun belts and let them fall to the dusty ground. Reacher shoved Brody away from him. The sheriff stumbled and fell. "This is my town," Brody screamed, his face red with humiliation. "You're a dead man." "Your town is a cesspool," Reacher said, "and you're the biggest toad in it." He ejected the magazine from Brody's pistol, throwing it one way. He worked the slide, ejecting the chambered round, and threw the empty gun the other way. He walked over to the deputy cars, pulled the keys from the ignitions, and tossed them onto the roof of the diner. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the sheriff and his 4 deputies disarmed and humiliated in the middle of Main Street. He didn't look back. He knew where he had to go. He had to find Rosalie and that file. The game had just been escalated, and he intended to finish it. Reacher found Rosalie in the alley behind the diner, her face pale with shock and a strange newfound hope. "I've never seen anyone do that," she breathed. "You took on the whole department." "They're not cops. They're security guards," Reacher said. "And not very good ones. We need to move. They'll be back, and they'll bring more friends. Where's the file?" "Follow me," she said, her fear replaced by a steely determination. "But we have to be careful. The Daltons have eyes everywhere." She led him through a maze of back alleys and overgrown yards, moving with a familiarity born of a lifetime spent in the town's shadows. They ended up behind an old abandoned church at the edge of town. The paint was peeling, and the windows were boarded up. "In here," she said, prying open a loose board over a cellar window. "My father used to bring me here when I was a kid. He was the caretaker. No one's been inside for years." They slipped through the window into a dark, musty-smelling cellar. Rosalie produced a small flashlight from her pocket, its beam cutting through the thick darkness. She led him to a corner where a section of the stone wall looked different from the rest. She worked her fingers into the cracks and pulled. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a dusty metal box. She lifted it out and placed it on the floor, her hands trembling slightly as she opened the lid. Inside was a thick ledger and a stack of papers held together with a rubber band. "This is it," she said. "My father's notes, shipping records he secretly copied, account numbers for offshore banks. It's all here. Proof that the Daltons Ranch is a distribution hub for a massive drug trafficking operation. They use the ranch's cattle trucks to move the product all over the country." Reacher picked up the ledger. The entries were meticulous, detailing dates, quantities, and truck numbers. It was a complete blueprint of the entire criminal enterprise. It was a death sentence for Elias Dalton and his sons. "This is enough," Reacher said. "This will put them away for life." "But how do we get it to the right people?" Rosalie asked. "Brody will have the roads blocked. We're trapped here." Before Reacher could answer, they heard the sound of vehicles pulling up outside the church. Multiple engines, doors slamming. "They found us," Rosalie whispered, her face losing all its color. Reacher moved to the cellar window and peered through a crack in the boards. He saw 2 pickup trucks and Sheriff Brody's car. Brody, Jeb, and at least 6 other men, all armed with rifles and shotguns, were surrounding the church. They had him trapped. "Stay here," Reacher said to Rosalie, "and stay quiet." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What I do best," Reacher said. "I'm going to even the odds." "Reacher!" Brody's voice boomed from outside, amplified by a megaphone. "We know you're in there. You and the girl. It's over. Come out with your hands up." Reacher didn't answer. He was scanning the cellar, his mind working, calculating angles, exits, and possibilities. There was a set of wooden stairs leading up to the main floor of the church. It was his only way out, other than the window they'd come in through. "You have 1 minute, Reacher," Brody yelled. "Then we're coming in, and we're not going to be gentle." Reacher looked at Rosalie. "When the shooting starts, you get out through the window and run. Head for the woods and don't stop. Don't look back." "I'm not leaving you," she said defiantly. "You are," Reacher said, his voice hard. "This file is more important than either of us. You get it to the state police in the next county. Ask for Captain Miller. Tell him Jack Reacher sent you. He's an old friend. He'll listen." He picked up a heavy, rusted pipe that was leaning against the wall. It had a good weight to it. He moved to the bottom of the stairs, melting into the deep shadows. "Time's up," Brody shouted. The main doors of the church crashed open upstairs. Reacher heard the sound of heavy boots on the wooden floorboards. They were spreading out, searching. "Check the cellar," someone shouted. A heavy-set man with a shotgun started down the rickety wooden stairs. He was holding a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Reacher held his breath, pressing himself flat against the stone wall. The man reached the bottom of the stairs, sweeping the light across the cellar. The beam passed over Reacher's position, then swept back. The man saw him. His eyes widened. He started to bring the shotgun up. He was too slow. Reacher moved, a blur of motion in the darkness. He swung the pipe in a short, brutal arc. It connected with the man's knee with a sickening crack. The man screamed and went down, his shotgun clattering on the floor. Reacher scooped it up. It was a pump-action 12-gauge, a beautiful weapon in a situation like this. He worked the action, chambering around. The sound, shuck shuck, was loud and distinctive in the confines of the cellar. "Go!" he hissed at Rosalie. She hesitated for a second, then scrambled towards the window. Upstairs, the other men heard the scream and the sound of the shotgun. "He's in the cellar!" Reacher didn't wait. He charged up the stairs, the shotgun held ready. He emerged onto the main floor of the church just as 2 of Dalton's men were rushing the cellar door. He fired from the hip. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The buckshot caught the first man square in the chest, throwing him backward off his feet. The second man dove for cover behind a row of pews. Reacher pumped the action again. Shuck shuck. He was a hunter now, and this was his territory. He moved through the cavernous church, using the rows of pews as cover. He could hear men shouting, their positions confused. They had expected a cornered animal. They had found a predator. Another man popped up from behind the pulpit, raising a rifle. Reacher fired again. The heavy wooden pulpit exploded into splinters. The man screamed and dropped out of sight, clutching a shattered arm. Shuck shuck. 4 shots left. He knew Brody and Jeb would be more cautious. They were outside, waiting for him to be flushed out. He needed to change the game. He sprinted towards the side of the church, towards the tall, stained-glass windows. He fired his third shot, shattering a depiction of a serene-looking saint. Glass rained down. He used the butt of the shotgun to smash out the remaining shards in the wooden frame. He leaped through the opening, landing in a crouch on the dry grass outside. He was in the open. A risky move, but it was the last thing they expected. 2 men who were guarding the side of the church spun around in surprise. Reacher fired twice, the blast echoing across the landscape. 2 men down. He was out of ammo. He dropped the empty shotgun and started to run, not away from the fight, but towards it. He rounded the back of the church just as Jeb and another man were coming around the other side. They saw him and raised their rifles. Reacher dove, hitting the ground and rolling behind an old stone tomb in the church's graveyard. Bullets chewed up the ground where he had been. He was pinned down, and he was unarmed. He could hear them advancing, spreading out to flank him. He was trapped. He looked around desperately. His eyes fell on the heavy iron gate to the cemetery, rusted and hanging off one hinge. An idea formed, a crazy, desperate idea. He waited until he could hear their footsteps getting closer. Then he burst from behind the tomb, running not away, but straight at the iron gate. He hit it with all his weight, using his shoulder as a ram. The remaining hinge groaned and then snapped. The massive gate, weighing hundreds of pounds, toppled over with a deafening crash right into the path of Jeb and his companion. The other man was crushed instantly. Jeb managed to jump back, but the gate caught his leg, pinning him to the ground with a sound of snapping bone. He screamed in agony, his rifle skittering out of his reach. Reacher was on him in a second. He picked up the rifle. Now he was armed again. He looked down at Jeb, whose face was white with pain and terror. "Where's your father?" Reacher demanded. "Go to hell," Jeb spat through gritted teeth. Reacher pressed the muzzle of the rifle against Jeb's good knee. "I can make the pain stop, or I can make it a whole lot worse. Your choice." Jeb stared into Reacher's cold, merciless eyes and saw no bluff. "The ranch," he gasped. "He's at the ranch. He's waiting for you." "And the sheriff?" "He ran," Jeb groaned. "Took off in his car when the shooting started. He's a coward." Reacher stood up. He knew where he had to go for the final act. The Dalton Ranch. He had to cut the head off the snake. He left Jeb screaming in the graveyard and started walking towards the main road, towards the ranch. The final confrontation was coming. The Dalton Ranch was 5 miles out of town, a sprawling property surrounded by a high fence and a single guarded gate. Reacher didn't go near the gate. He followed the fence line, moving through the rough scrubland under the cover of the approaching dusk. He found what he was looking for, a section where a dry wash ran under the fence, creating a gap just large enough for a man to crawl through. He slipped onto the property and moved towards the main compound, a large modern ranch house, several barns, and a series of outbuildings. Lights were on everywhere. He could see armed men patrolling the grounds. Elias Dalton was waiting, and he had his entire private army ready. Reacher watched from a ridge overlooking the compound, studying the patrols, the layout, the lines of sight. He wasn't going to storm the place. That was suicide. He was going to dismantle it piece by piece. He started with the power. He found the main generator behind one of the barns, a big diesel machine thrumming away. A few well-placed shots from Jeb's rifle, and the generator sputtered, coughed black smoke, and died. The entire compound was plunged into darkness except for the emergency lights inside the main house. Shouts of confusion and anger rose from the guards. Reacher smiled. Confusion was his ally. He used the chaos to slip closer, moving like a ghost between the darkened buildings. He took out the first 2 guards with silent, brutal efficiency, using his knife. He took their radios. He could hear the panicked chatter as they tried to figure out what was happening. He made his way to the largest barn. From Rosalie's files, he knew this was the hub of the operation, where the drugs were packaged and loaded onto the trucks. He pried open a side door and slipped inside. The smell of hay, manure, and chemicals hit him. In the dim light from the moon, he could see several large cattle trucks, and stacked against the far wall were dozens of large plastic-wrapped bales. The mother lode. He found what he needed, cans of gasoline for the farm equipment. He started dousing the bales, the floor, the trucks themselves. He worked quickly and silently. When he was done, he created a long trail of fuel leading to the door. He was about to light it when he heard a voice from the barn's loft. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Reacher froze. He looked up. Elias Dalton was standing in the loft, silhouetted against a window. He was holding a hunting rifle. He wasn't a big man, but he radiated an aura of cold, ruthless power. "You've been a busy man, Mr. Reacher," Dalton said, his voice calm. "You've cost me a lot of money and a lot of good men tonight, and one of my sons." "They made their choice," Reacher said, his eyes darting around, looking for an exit. "So they did," Dalton said, "and now you've made yours. Did you really think you could just walk in here and tear down everything I've built?" "I'm not walking out," Reacher said, "and neither are you." Dalton laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You have spirit, I'll give you that. But this is the end of the line." He raised his rifle. But Reacher had been waiting for that moment. He threw himself into a dive, rolling behind one of the massive tires of a cattle truck just as Dalton fired. The shot boomed in the barn, the bullet ricocheting off the concrete floor. Reacher pulled out a disposable lighter from his pocket. He flicked it on, the small flame dancing in the darkness. "It's over, Dalton," Reacher yelled. "This whole place is about to go up in smoke, along with all your product." He could see the flicker of panic in Dalton's eyes. The drugs were his lifeblood. "You're bluffing," Dalton snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Reacher said, holding the flame close to the trail of gasoline. "There's only one way out of this barn, and I'm right next to it. You can come down here and face me, or you can burn with your fortune." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, Reacher heard Dalton moving, coming down the ladder from the loft. He emerged from the shadows, his rifle held at the ready. "Let's finish this then," Dalton said, his face a mask of cold hatred. He fired again. Reacher ducked, the bullets screaming past his ear. Reacher dropped the lighter onto the trail of gasoline. The fuel ignited with a whoosh, a river of fire racing across the barn floor towards the gasoline-soaked bales. The barn was instantly illuminated by an eerie, dancing orange light. Dalton stared in horror as the fire reached the trucks and the drugs. He screamed in rage and charged at Reacher, firing his rifle wildly. Reacher moved, using the burning trucks as cover. The heat was becoming intense. The smoke was thick and choking. The two men stalked each other in the fiery inferno of the barn. It was a primal fight, surrounded by the destruction of a criminal empire. Reacher knew he had to end it quickly, before the whole structure collapsed. He saw Dalton trying to circle around a burning truck to get a clear shot. Reacher anticipated the move. He picked up a heavy wrench from a workbench and threw it with all his might. The wrench spun through the smoky air and caught Dalton in the side of the head. The rancher staggered, his rifle falling from his hands. Reacher closed the distance in a heartbeat. Dalton pulled a hunting knife from his belt and lunged. Reacher sidestepped the wild slash and grabbed Dalton's wrist, twisting it until the bone snapped. Dalton howled in pain, dropping the knife. Reacher hit him with a series of short, devastating blows to the body, then a final, powerful uppercut that lifted the smaller man off his feet. Elias Dalton collapsed onto the floor, unconscious, as the flames roared around them. Reacher grabbed him by the collar and dragged him out of the burning barn, just as the roof began to collapse in a shower of sparks and embers. He dumped Dalton on the ground as the first sirens began to wail in the distance. Rosalie had made it. The cavalry was coming. Reacher didn't wait around to take credit. He didn't want a medal or a thank you. His work was done. He slipped back into the darkness, crossed the fence, and started walking down the long, empty highway. The sky behind him was glowing red from the fire that was cleansing the town of Redemption. By the time the sun came up, he was gone. Just another ghost on the road.